It was one of those quiet, ordinary summer afternoons that never seemed remarkable until the moment it became unforgettable. June 12th, 2011, a Sunday that started with sunlight flickering through the birch trees outside Ellsworth, Maine. The Harper family had gathered for their annual picnic by the Penobscot River, a ritual they'd done every June for as long as anyone could remember. It was supposed to be simple: burgers on the portable grill, paper plates, cousins running barefoot through the grass, and the sound of the river moving slowly and heavily behind the trees. Emily Harper was 6 years old, the youngest of three, the one everyone called the Echo because her laugh always followed someone else's. She wore a yellow sundress with a sunflower stitched near the collar and a pair of pink sandals her mother had just bought her the week before. Her father, Mark, was setting up the cooler when she tugged at his sleeve and asked if she could play near the bubble wand, and her aunt had brought for the kids. "Stay where I can see you," he told her. Those would be the last words he ever spoke to her. For the next few minutes, everything seemed normal. The air smelled of charcoal and sunscreen. Her brothers were skipping stones at the water's edge, and someone turned on a small Bluetooth speaker playing a country song that didn't quite fit the mood of the woods. Then, sometime around 2:17 p.m., someone noticed that Emily wasn't laughing anymore. At first, it didn't trigger panic. Parents at picnics assume the simplest thing: she's behind the trees, or chasing a frog, or hiding behind the car. But after 30 seconds of calling her name with no answer, voices started to strain. Her mother, Lisa, dropped the tongs she was holding and began running in circles around the clearing, shouting louder each time. Mark sprinted toward the trail that led deeper into the woods. Within minutes, everyone was searching, calling out, "Emily!" Thick green air that seemed to swallow sound whole. By 2:30, the mood had shifted from confusion to terror. Her brothers began crying, unsure if they were in trouble or part of something bigger they couldn't understand. Lisa's voice cracked as she screamed for someone to call 911. The dispatcher logged the call at 2:32 p.m., marking the start of what would become one of the longest-running missing child cases in Hancock County history. The first responding deputy arrived just after 3. He found the family scattered along the riverbank, their picnic still laid out on the blanket as if frozen in time. The officer noted a half-eaten hot dog on a plate, a bubble wand on the grass, and 2 small pink sandals placed neatly beside a maple tree about 15 feet from the tree line. The ground was soft with moss, but there were no footprints beyond that point. By late afternoon, the area was crawling with emergency vehicles. Search dogs were brought in, followed by forest rangers and volunteers from nearby towns. Helicopters circled above, their rotors chopping through the quiet. Search grids were mapped out in 10-yard sections, each one scoured for signs of the little girl in the yellow dress. Nothing. As daylight faded, the first strange realization hit the search teams. There was no trail. In missing child cases, even when the outcome is grim, there's usually something: a piece of clothing, a set of footprints, disturbed soil, drag marks, something that suggests a direction. But here, the forest floor was untouched. It was as if she had stepped beyond the clearing and vanished into the air. By nightfall, floodlights illuminated the trees as volunteers shouted her name in intervals. "Emily! Emily Harper!" The sound echoed through the timber but returned empty. The sheriff made the decision to keep the search running overnight. Thermal imaging units were called in. The temperature dropped into the 50 seconds, and mist began rising from the river. The scene, once filled with picnic laughter, now looked like something from a nightmare: flashing red lights against dark trees, people moving with flashlights, dogs barking into the distance. Inside the command tent, officers began to realize how little they had to work with. Mark told investigators that Emily had been no more than 20 yards away when he last saw her. Lisa said she looked down for maybe 10 seconds to check the grill. Her cousin Hannah insisted she saw Emily bending near the bubble wand, just at the edge of the clearing, before turning back toward the food. In that short, ordinary window of distraction, a blink in adult time, a child had disappeared. By dawn, more than 40 people were combing the area. Boats patrolled the river. Divers searched shallow eddies and bends. Even though the currents there were mild, Forest Service helicopters expanded the radius by 2 miles, scanning for the bright color of the dress. There was nothing, not even a single torn thread. Investigators began to suspect abduction, though it didn't fit the usual patterns. There were no tire tracks fresh enough to match the timeline, and the access road to the picnic site had been empty according to every witness. No one remembered hearing another vehicle or seeing strangers. The area was rural, bordered by a forest preserve on 3 sides and water on the 4th. As the second day began, exhaustion and disbelief set in. Search crews rotated in 12-hour shifts. Family members were interviewed separately, each recounting the same story with the same bewildered tone. "She was just there," one relative said, and then she wasn't. The press began arriving by the 3rd day, broadcasting live updates from the road. Missing posters with Emily's face, brown eyes, missing front tooth. Yellow dress began appearing on telephone poles across Ellsworth. The FBI joined the case by day 4. Every registered offender within 50 miles was questioned. Still, no leads. As the week dragged on, hope gave way to ritual. Every morning, Lisa Harper stood by the river, calling her daughter's name as the sun rose. Each night, she left the porch light on at home. Search teams stopped using words like find and started using recover. By the 10th day, the official search was scaled back. The sheriff's department called it temporary suspension pending new evidence. The Harpers refused to leave the clearing. They slept in their truck, listening to the hum of insects and the soft current of the water. On the 11th night, Mark whispered that he could still hear her laugh, not from memory, but somewhere out there in the dark. When the final search grid was closed, the case report listed the last known location as Riverside Picnic Clearing, coordinates 44.57 newtons, -68, 42W. The final line read, "No visible signs of struggle, no evidence of abduction, no trace of the victim beyond the clearing." For years, that single line would haunt everyone who read it, because for all the technology, the dogs, and the manpower, nothing in that forest explained how a child could walk 20 steps and never leave a footprint behind. And as the summer ended and leaves began to fall, the clearing remained empty, just a patch of grass by a quiet river. But the locals would tell you, even long after the search ended, the sound of laughter sometimes drifted through those trees around dusk. No one could ever prove where it came from. 13 years later, something would finally appear in that same clearing, something that would make investigators realize that the story of Emily Harper had never truly ended. It had only been buried, waiting to be seen. The investigation into Emily Harper's disappearance began before sunrise on the 2nd day, when the search commander gathered everyone at the clearing and spread out a large laminated map across the hood of a patrol truck. He told them they were going to rebuild every minute of the timeline, from the moment the family arrived to the exact second Emily vanished. Every person, every movement, every sound. Because somewhere inside that brief ordinary window, something irreversible had happened. Detectives started by marking the arrival times. The Harpers had pulled into the site at 11:42 a.m., confirmed by a timestamp on a photo her cousin posted on social media. Emily standing in the grass, arms stretched out toward the sun. At 12:10, the grill was lit. At 1:45, the kids were blowing bubbles near the maple tree. And at 2:17, according to the first 911 call record, she was gone. Those 32 minutes became the core of the investigation, a time frame the detectives would revisit again and again, trying to find the exact point where the world seemed to blink. They expanded the search grid half a mile in every direction. Dozens of volunteers combed through the woods shoulder to shoulder, flagged every depression in the soil, every broken branch. Dogs followed what seemed to be faint traces of scent toward the riverbank but stopped abruptly near a patch of trampled reeds. Investigators found bent stalks and disturbed mud, as if something or someone had been there briefly. But no footprints followed, no torn fabric, no hair or blood, just silence and running water. Helicopters equipped with infrared scanned the area that night, detecting only warm patches of earth left by the search crews themselves. The woods were too dense, the canopy too thick. The drone of engines faded into the night, leaving behind the sound of radios and voices calling her name. For days, investigators searched on foot, horseback, and by boat. The river currents were mapped, tested, and even dredged in places. If Emily had gone into the water, they would have found some trace. But there was nothing, not a single piece of her clothing, Not one shoe, not even a strand of hair. As theories began to take shape, detectives started to divide into two camps. One believed she had wandered into the woods, become lost, and perhaps succumbed to the elements. The other, quieter camp began to suspect an abduction. But the second theory raised more questions than it answered. The clearing was isolated, surrounded by dense trees. The only access road was visible from where the family had been sitting. No one reported hearing a car. No engines. No doors. No screams. When investigators began interviewing relatives, subtle inconsistencies started to appear. Lisa Harper was adamant that Emily had been standing near the picnic blanket when she looked away. Mark said she'd been by the tree line. Their accounts were separated by maybe 15 feet, but to detectives, it mattered. Emily's cousin Hannah said she saw the girl chasing Bubbles toward the woods, though she couldn't remember if it was before or after she heard her aunt calling. Another cousin mentioned something that would haunt the case for years, a white van parked near the trailhead earlier that afternoon. He said it had been there when they first arrived, positioned just off the dirt road with its side door facing away. At the time, it didn't seem strange. There were often fishermen or hikers nearby. But when the deputies checked the area less than an hour later, the van was gone. They searched tire marks, photographed impressions, and sent them to the lab. But the prints were too faint to match. Detectives canvassed nearby gas stations, diners, and the main road for security footage. Nothing. No van. No witness who'd seen one leave. When the media learned about the white van, it spread instantly. Call centers flooded with tips, hundreds of them. People swore they'd seen the same vehicle in nearby towns, near schools, even at a gas station 3 counties away. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny. None matched. Detectives pulled traffic camera data from Route 1 for a 20-mile stretch. No vehicle matching the description appeared at any relevant time. As the days turned to weeks, the investigation shifted from hope to protocol. The family was cleared of suspicion after polygraph testing and alibi verification. The father, Mark, continued to work intermittently, though he spent most of his evenings driving back to the site. Lisa stopped going to work altogether. She spent her days at the riverbank, often sitting for hours staring into the trees, as if waiting for Emily to walk out at any moment. The sheriff's office coordinated one final large-scale search at the end of June, expanding the perimeter to 5 miles. Nearly 200 volunteers showed up, locals, hikers, even out-of-town officers. The woods buzzed with radio chatter, orange flags marking every discovered item. Most turned out to be nothing more than discarded bottles, pieces of tarp, or animal bones. Around mid-afternoon, one searcher found what looked like a child's ribbon tangled in the brush. It was blue. Emily's had been yellow. The search officially concluded on July 2nd. The report from the Maine Warden Service summarized the effort in precise, emotionless language. Search concluded after 9 days, covering approximately 14 square miles. No confirmed evidence of human presence located beyond the clearing. It was a bureaucratic sentence that couldn't possibly capture the reality of that summer, the exhausted faces, the smell of wet earth, or the sound of a mother whispering her daughter's name into the dark. But even when the official effort stopped, the locals didn't. Volunteer groups kept returning every weekend, sweeping the woods with metal detectors and dogs. Amateur investigators built online maps, connecting reported sightings, theories, and terrain models. Some suggested the river currents might have pulled her miles downstream. Others argued she'd been taken by someone familiar with the area. A few believed she was still alive somewhere. By August, the number of his volunteers dwindled. The news trucks left. The flyers began to fade in the rain. And the Harpers, unable to return to their home filled with toys and unopened birthday gifts, rented a small cabin just 2 miles from the clearing. Every morning, Mark drove to town for coffee, then parked by the access road, watching the tree line for hours. Lisa joined him most evenings, sitting quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded around the same stuffed bear Emily used to sleep with. They didn't talk much anymore. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. Autumn came early that year. Leaves fell, covering the dirt path where the investigation had once been centered. The police stored their files, sealed the evidence bags, and moved the case to cold storage. Time dulled the urgency, but not the ache. For the Harpers, the clearing never stopped calling them back. It was where everything had started, and where their lives had stopped. By the time the first snow covered the riverbank, the case of Emily Harper had officially gone cold. But even then, strange reports continued to trickle in, a child's voice heard by campers at night, footprints that appeared after rain and vanished by morning. Nothing verifiable, nothing solid, just whispers. The investigation was frozen, the trail buried under time and weather. Yet, somewhere out there, in those same woods, the answer still waited silent, buried beneath layers of soil and secrecy. And 13 years later, it would take a new kind of eye in the sky to finally find it. Every case we share takes weeks of research, fact-checking, and long nights piecing together real lives that were lost. These stories matter. Someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth, please like, subscribe, and comment which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. For more disturbing and heartbreaking cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. By the summer of 2013, the story of Emily Harper had faded from the front pages, but never from the minds of those who lived near the river. The clearing where she vanished was still there, quiet, green, and unremarkable, the kind of place hikers passed without knowing its history. A few flowers, long wilted, still marked the edge of the path where the family had once set their blanket. For most, the case had become a sad memory. For the Harpers, it was a wound that never healed. 2 years had passed since that June afternoon, and the investigation had gone silent. No new leads, no breakthroughs. The file was cold. But then, on an overcast Sunday in late August, a pair of hikers called the county sheriff's office with something strange. They claimed that while walking near the same section of woods, about half a mile from the old picnic site, they'd heard what sounded like a child's voice. The man who made the call said it wasn't shouting or crying, it was laughter. A faint, high-pitched giggle echoes through the trees. The hikers had stopped, waited, and recorded what they could on a cell phone. When deputies arrived hours later, they played the audio. It was hard to make out over the sound of leaves and wind, but for a few seconds, there was something, a faint rise in tone that did sound, unmistakably, like a small child laughing. It was enough to bring investigators back. The next morning, the sheriff's department reopened a limited search of the area. They found nothing on the surface, no footprints, no signs of recent activity, until one deputy noticed something odd near a collapsed drainage culvert that ran beneath an old service path. Inside the rusted pipe, just above the water line, were several small impressions on the inner wall. Handprints, roughly the size of a child's. The prints were smeared in a thin layer of mud and algae, but they were there, clear, enough to see with a flashlight. Forensic techs photographed them, swabbed for DNA, and sent the samples to the state lab in Augusta. For weeks, everyone waited. Lisa Harper, who hadn't been back to the site in nearly a year, stood by the river the day they took the samples, holding onto the same necklace Emily used to wear. She told a local reporter she wasn't sure whether she wanted it to be real. The hope hurt too much. The results came back a week later. The samples contained no usable DNA. The material was environmental, a mix of sediment, plant residue, and trace animal oils. The handprints, investigators concluded, were likely the result of someone crawling through the culvert months earlier, possibly a child playing or even a raccoon brushing the wall. The report was short. The hope it shattered was immeasurable. Still, the discovery reignited public interest. Old theories resurfaced, and new ones spread online. On message boards, self-appointed investigators began dissecting maps, topography charts, and elevation data. Some claimed to have found patterns in the terrain that search crews missed, irregular depressions in satellite images that could indicate an old sinkhole or well. Others insisted the river had shifted course, that the current in 2011 might have hidden her body beneath silt that was only now eroding. In Ellsworth, locals gathered at the diner to talk about it again, for the first time in years. The waitress who'd once served the Harpers after church said she couldn't believe how fast the rumors returned, as if people needed to bring Emily back into conversation just to fill the silence. And maybe they did, because silence was the one thing the case had too much of. Then another claim surfaced. A retired lumber worker named Earl McBride contacted the sheriff's office, saying he'd seen a little girl in a white dress near an old ranger shack roughly a mile from the picnic site. He said it was early morning, around dawn, and that the figure had been standing by the tree line watching him. He'd called out, thinking it was someone's child, but she turned and walked into the brush before he could approach. He hadn't thought much of it until he saw the story about the hikers on the news. Detectives took his statement seriously enough to investigate. They drove McBride to the location he described an abandoned ranger post, weather-beaten and half-collapsed. Inside were empty cans, bird droppings, and the remnants of a campfire. Forensics swept the site, taking soil samples and fabric scraps from the floor. None matched anything in Emily's case file. When reporters asked McBride to describe what he saw, he hesitated. "She looked about 6, he said quietly. "But that doesn't make sense, does it?" His voice cracked when he realized what he'd just implied. The media seized on the story anyway. "Mysterious sighting revives Ellsworth case." One headline read, "For a few weeks, Emily's picture appeared on television again. Talk shows discussed new possibilities. Psychics offered theories. A documentary crew from Boston showed up and filmed interviews near the clearing, narrating it like some ghost story." For Lisa and Mark Harper, watching their daughter's face on television again brought everything back: the noise, the strangers, the speculation. They stopped answering the phone altogether. Online, amateur sleuths turned the area into an obsession. Reddit threads filled with drone footage, map overlays, and theories about hidden wells from the logging era. Some users claimed to have found perfect circles in thermal imaging maps, pointing to them as possible sinkholes or covered shafts. One group even organized an unofficial dig near the ranger shack after obtaining old property records. They uncovered bones, small, brittle, and pale, but they belonged to a deer. The sheriff's department issued a public statement urging residents not to interfere with active sites, but by then, the damage was done. The area that had once been quiet and sacred to the Harpers had become a spectacle again, a place for strangers to search for closure that wasn't theirs to find. For the family, each false lead was its own kind of death. Every rumor reopened wounds that had never healed, and every debunked clue left them emptier than before. Mark told a friend privately that he'd started dreaming about the woods again, not of finding Emily, but of searching and never stopping, walking forever through fog that never lifted. Lisa stopped going to the grocery store in town because she couldn't handle people asking if she'd heard the latest theory. By late autumn, interest faded once more. The hiker's recording was analyzed again by sound experts, who determined it could have been an echo, a bird call distorted by the valley walls. The handprints were declared inconclusive, but likely unrelated. The sighting near the ranger shack was logged and filed away. All that remained were more unanswered questions. As winter set in, the woods fell silent again, the clearing blanketed in frost. But for those who had been part of the search, the echoes of that summer, the laughter, the voices, the false hope lingered. It was as if the forest itself carried the memory of what had happened there, whispering it back whenever someone got too close. And for the Harpers, even though they'd stopped visiting as often, they could never truly leave. Because every time a phone rang or a stranger called with a tip, it meant one impossible thing: that somewhere, somehow, Emily might still be out there. They didn't know it yet, but another decade would pass before those woods gave up their secret. And when they did, it wouldn't come from a voice in the trees or a rumor in a diner. It would come from above, from a single quiet eye in the sky that finally saw what everyone else had missed. By the Praja, the summer of 2018. The case of Emily Harper had become a file buried so deep in the archives of the Hancock County Sheriff's Department that most of the new deputies had never even heard of it. The few who did only knew fragments: the missing girl, the river clearing, the endless search that found nothing. The original investigators had retired or transferred, and the evidence boxes sat on a forgotten metal shelf, dust thick enough to dull the labels. It had been 7 years since the last official search, and in that time, nature had swallowed the clearing whole. The woods had grown denser, the trail narrower. The forest seemed to erase its own history. Then, in early 2018, the department launched a digitization initiative, an effort to scan and re-examine old cold cases, before storage deterioration made them unreadable. That's how Sergeant Dana Klein found Emily's name. She was new to the department, a meticulous investigator with a reputation for noticing small things others overlooked. While most officers saw cold cases as ghosts that would never speak again, Klein believed that even silence had patterns and patterns could be broken. The Harper case file was enormous. Dozens of reports, hundreds of photographs, maps with red marker grids showing where search teams had once walked shoulder to shoulder. As she began digitizing the files, one detail caught her attention: the aerial imagery from the original search. The photos, grainy and slightly blurred, showed the layout of the woods and surrounding terrain. But as she compared them to updated satellite images from the past decade, something didn't add up. In the 2011 maps, the tree coverage along the northern edge of the search area appeared consistent, thick, uniform. But in the newer images, that same section looked uneven, almost hollowed in one corner. A growth anomaly, maybe, or an area where the vegetation had died back. Klein overlaid the two sets of images and realized there was a section of land roughly 200 yards long that hadn't been part of the original search grid. The omission wasn't intentional. According to the field notes, that area had been labeled unsuitable for traversal, swampy, knee-deep marshland that would have required specialized equipment the team didn't have. At the time, the priority had been to cover the accessible zones, and by the time the marsh drained weeks later, the operation had already shut down. Klein frowned at the oversight. It was small, easy to dismiss, but in her line of work, small oversights were where truths tended to hide. She pulled the terrain reports from that area. No subsequent surveys. No mention of the land being revisited. It was a blind spot, one that had gone unnoticed for 13 years. The more Klein stared at the maps, the more it bothered her. She requested new high-resolution imagery of the location through a volunteer drone network that often assisted with cold case reviews. Within days, 2 civilian drone pilots from Bangor, both former engineers, agreed to help. They met her in the woods on a cool, overcast morning, the air still heavy from the previous night's rain. The clearing was barely recognizable now, swallowed by new growth and silence. As the drones lifted into the air, Klein watched the live feed on a tablet. The images streamed back sharp and clear, every ridge, shadow, and break in the canopy rendered in striking detail. At first it was nothing unusual: dense pine, scattered birch, and marshy depressions filled with moss and stagnant water. But as one drone passed over the northern perimeter, Klein noticed something faint just beneath the surface of the overgrowth, a shape too geometric to be natural. A rectangle, roughly 15 feet long, is faintly visible through the moss and dirt. The pilot hovered, adjusting angles. The outline became clearer, clean, defined edges, like a foundation or structure buried under in years of soil and roots. Klein leaned in, her voice tightening as she asked for multiple passes. The second drone captured infrared stills, revealing a slightly cooler temperature along the outline's perimeter, consistent with decomposed organic material beneath the surface. She didn't say it out loud, but the thought formed instantly. Someone had missed this. That night, Klein filed an official request for a ground search and forwarded the imagery to the State Forensics Division. The preliminary analysis was cautious but promising. The rectangular impression, they said, could indicate a collapsed man-made structure, possibly an old shed or picnic shelter, from when the area had been used for recreational purposes decades earlier. There were no records of any structures there now. 2 weeks later, a ground team assembled. It wasn't large, just a handful of forensic archaeologists, 2 deputies, and Klein. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of pine and decay. As they moved toward the overgrown section, their boots sank slightly into the soft ground. The forest felt untouched, older, almost reluctant to give anything back. The archaeologists began probing the soil with long metal rods, marking resistance points. Within minutes, one of them called out. Beneath a layer of compacted dirt and roots, the rods struck something solid. Wooden material, brittle but distinct. The grid was expanded, and measurements were taken. As they cleared the surface vegetation, the faint edges of what looked like a collapsed wooden floor emerged. It was unmistakable, a man-made structure buried just below the surface, one that hadn't been visible in any of the prior search documentation. The boards were old, rotted, fused together by mud and time. A few fragments of rusted nails clung to the corners. When they finally pried one loose, the smell of damp wood and silt filled the air. Klein stood back, watching as they worked in silence. Every scrape of a trowel, every shift of dirt felt like peeling back a layer of history and guilt. 13 years, she thought. 13 years this was here. Missed by inches. Once the team marked the perimeter, Klein called for the Harpers. It was a call she dreaded making. By now, Lisa and Mark Harper lived quietly on the outskirts of town. They had stopped attending vigils years ago, stopped granting interviews, stopped hoping out loud. But they still kept the same number, still answered whenever the sheriff's office called. When Klein explained what they'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Lisa's voice, when it finally came, was steady but distant. She asked if they were sure. Klein told her they weren't, not yet. But they'd found something that shouldn't have been there. The Harpers arrived the next morning. They stood behind the police tape as investigators continued to uncover the buried structure. Mark's hands were shaking, though his face didn't move. Lisa clutched a folded piece of paper, a missing poster so worn that the ink had faded into gray. No one said it, but everyone felt it, the impossible tension between hope and dread. The parents wanted answers, but answers meant an ending. After 13 years of not knowing, even pain had become a kind of stability. Now that the balance was being broken, by late afternoon, the excavation had exposed nearly the entire outline of the structure. It appeared to be a collapsed platform, possibly part of an old wooden shelter once used for picnics or camping decades before. The center section was partially hollow, filled with compacted mud and debris. As one of the archaeologists brushed away sediment, a glint of pink plastic caught the light. Klein crouched down. It was a fragment, smooth, curved, and faintly colored, like part of a toy or shoe strap. The color was familiar. She didn't say a word. Not yet. Instead, she marked the discovery, sealed it for lab testing, and made a note in her log. Preliminary analysis would take days, maybe longer, but she knew enough to understand that this was no coincidence. The location, the forgotten search zone, the rectangular pit, it all fit too perfectly to ignore. That night, as the forest fell quiet again, the Harpers sat in their car by the access road, staring at the glow of the floodlights through the trees. Neither spoke. After so many years of silence, words felt useless. For the first time since 2011, there was movement in the case, real, physical proof that something had been overlooked. But with that discovery came a question neither of them dared to voice aloud. What if the truth they'd been waiting for wasn't the one they wanted to hear? In the days that followed, lab results would confirm what everyone suspected. And when the ground was finally cleared, the truth about that buried structure and what lay beneath it would turn a missing person case into something far more haunting. When the drone footage was reviewed in full, no one in the room spoke for several minutes. The video was silent, save for the faint hum of the rotors and the steady drift of the camera as it passed over the tree line. At first, it showed only thick vegetation and uneven marshland, nothing out of place. But then, just as the drone banked toward the far northern section, something caught the light. A fractured, rectangular shape, half buried beneath layers of silt and moss. The drone paused, hovering, capturing frame after frame from different angles. It looked like the collapsed skeleton of a structure, wooden beams twisted and sunken into the earth. Edges too precise to belong to nature. The footage was sent to the forensic imaging team for enhancement. When they adjusted the contrast and stripped away the canopy overlay, the outline came into focus. A foundation, roughly 15 feet long, 6 feet across, forming what once might have been a small picnic shelter or observation platform. Historical records confirmed that, in the early 1980 seconds, the area had indeed contained a few wooden rest structures built by the county for fishermen and hikers. They were dismantled decades ago, after flooding made the terrain unsafe. Apparently, one had been missed. When the ground team arrived to clear the site, the forest was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of standing water and rot. The soil gave way under their boots as they waded through knee-deep muck. With shovels and hand tools, they began peeling away layers of debris, rotted planks, rusted bolts, fallen branches. Beneath it all, they uncovered the remains of the structure seen in the footage. Warped beams and fragments of flooring, pressed deep into the mud like a memory flattened by time. For hours, the work continued slowly, methodically. At first, it seemed like just another false lead, another piece of the past mistaken for something meaningful. But as one of the archaeologists sifted through a thick layer of silt along the northwest corner, a flash of color appeared. A small piece of pink plastic, no larger than a coin. It was smooth, curved, and slightly brittle, faded to a dull rose by years underground. When rinsed clean, the color deepened. It matched the exact shade of pink listed in the original case file, the color of Emily Harper's missing sandals. The site was immediately secured. Every motion was slowed to careful documentation. More debris was lifted, and beneath the splintered boards, they uncovered a small cavity, a hollow space, roughly the size of a child's body, sealed by layers of clay and runoff. The edges showed where the wood had collapsed inward, leaving an air pocket that somehow kept its shape. When one of the technicians brushed away the remaining sediment, a section of cloth appeared, then bone. The clearing fell silent. No one said her name, but everyone knew. Over the next several hours, the team worked in near total quiet, using soft brushes and small trowels to expose the remains. They were remarkably intact for having been buried more than a decade. The cavity's moisture had preserved the environment, sealing it off from air and bacteria. Alongside the bones, they found a thin, rusted chain entangled in the fabric. A pendant hung from it, barely legible. Its engraving dulled by oxidation, but under the right light, 2 letters could still be read: E.H. The discovery site was cordoned off, and the remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office in Augusta. Within days, forensic anthropologists confirmed what everyone had already begun to accept. The DNA matched. The remains were those of 6-year-old Emily Harper. The report arrived a week later. There were no signs of trauma consistent with violence, no fractures suggesting assault, no defensive injuries, no indications of foul play. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a single, heartbreaking conclusion: accidental entrapment. The bones of the lower leg showed microfractures typical of a fall from a short distance, and the splintered boards recovered at the site matched the age and type of wood used in the old picnic shelters once built along the river. Investigators reconstructed the most likely sequence of events. On that afternoon in 2011, Emily had likely wandered away from the picnic blanket, chasing after her bubble wand or a toy carried by the breeze. The abandoned shelter, half hidden by grass and brush, would have looked harmless, maybe even inviting. She might have stepped onto the old planks, unaware that they'd rotted from underneath. The boards gave way, and she fell into the shallow pit below, which immediately collapsed around her. The structure sealed itself shut, trapping her inside. Rain, silt, and time did the rest. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't an abduction. It was an accident, one that had been waiting quietly beneath everyone's feet all along. When the Harpers were told, they didn't speak for a long time. The sheriff's department later described that meeting as the quietest in memory. No shouting, no tears at first, just a kind of stunned stillness. Lisa Harper asked to see the pendant. When they handed it to her, she turned it over slowly, her thumb brushing the engraved letters as though she were tracing her daughter's name. She didn't cry until she noticed the chain had been knotted in one place, as if a small hand had once tugged on it. Mark Harper stood behind her, staring at the floor. He later told a reporter that hearing there was no foul play didn't make it easier. "It doesn't matter how," he said softly. "It's still what happened." In the following days, the news spread across the state. After 13 years of speculation, after theories about kidnappers, wild animals, and cover-ups, the truth turned out to be painfully simple. Local headlines called it "closure at last for Harper family." But anyone close to them knew that word didn't fit. Closure suggests something can be closed, and this was something that would never fully end. At the excavation site, forensic teams finished their work. They recovered remnants of the structure, confirming that it had been one of the original picnic shelters dismantled in 1989, but never fully removed. Over time, the remaining frame had been buried by floods, left to decay unnoticed. It had sat less than 200 yards from the original search perimeter, For investigators, the realization was difficult to accept. Years of searches, hundreds of volunteers, dogs, and divers, all of it had stopped just short of the truth. Had anyone stepped a few feet further, dug a little deeper, she might have been found long ago. One of the search coordinators, now retired, admitted through tears that the discovery hurt worse than any case he'd ever worked. He said he remembered walking that stretch of woods the first night. Emily disappeared and marking the marsh as too soft for passage. The guilt, he said, never left him. The evidence was clear. Emily Harper's death was ruled an accidental fall resulting in entrapment. The case was officially closed in late October 2018. But closure is not the same as peace. For the Harpers, the days that followed were spent quietly at home. They didn't hold a press conference. They didn't make a public statement. Instead, they arranged a small service, private, just family, and a few close friends. At the cemetery, they placed a new headstone beside the old memorial that had stood empty for years. The inscription read simply, "Found at last. Always near." In the weeks that followed, the site where she was discovered was reclaimed by the forest. The excavation pit was filled with water, reflecting the sky above it. The debris was cleared, the logs removed, but the faint outline of the structure remained visible from the air. For the drone pilots, it was haunting to revisit their footage to know that the camera had captured, in a single frame, what human eyes had missed for more than a decade. The discovery of Emily Harper didn't bring relief so much as it brought understanding. And that, sometimes, is the hardest kind of ending, the kind that leaves no villains to blame, no mysteries to chase, only the weight of what's been lost and the quiet truth of where it had been all along. 13 years of questions had ended in a single word that no one wanted to say out loud: accident. But in a small, unmarked corner of the forest, the place that had once been known only for tragedy would soon carry another name, a name that meant remembrance. Because even when the mystery was gone, Emily's story would remain. A few weeks after the confirmation, the Harpers finally laid their daughter to rest. The funeral was small, just family, a few friends, and the investigators who had stayed with the case for years. The burial site sat near the same river where she had vanished, less than a mile from the clearing. It was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, as though the air itself knows to stay silent. Lisa stood close to the casket, her hand resting on its surface, tracing small circles with her thumb as the minister spoke. Mark stood a step behind her, staring at the water beyond the trees. For years, that river had been a source of pain, a boundary between what was known and what wasn't. Now, it had come full circle, holding both their grief and their answer. When the service ended, no one moved for a long time. Some of the search volunteers from 2011 stood near the back, hats in hand, eyes low. They'd combed these woods for weeks back then, convinced they'd somehow missed something. And now, seeing the family here, they realized they had. The flowers at the gravesite were simple lilies and daisies, the same kind Emily had once picked from her mother's garden. That evening, the town gathered for a vigil at the reopened clearing. The forest, once dense and overgrown, had been cleared and leveled. Wooden benches lined the path, leading to a small stone marker engraved with the words, "Emily's Rest." It had been the idea of Sergeant Dana Klein, the detective who'd refused to let the case stay buried. The townspeople brought candles and photographs, some of them strangers to the Harpers but drawn by the story that had haunted their community for more than a decade. As the sun went down, the light through the trees turned gold, scattering across the crowd. The flicker of hundreds of candles created a wavering sea of light that reflected off the riverbank. The sound of the wind moved through the leaves in soft bursts, carrying whispers that no one could quite make out. A few people spoke, neighbors, teachers, one of the first responders from that day in 2011, but the words that lingered most came from Klein. She spoke slowly, not as an officer but as someone who'd spent months staring into the heart of the woods. She said the forest had hidden Emily, not out of cruelty, but in the way nature sometimes reclaims what it touches. Over the years, storms, floods, and time had covered what no one could see. For 13 years, she said, it wasn't just the woods that held her, it was this town, this family, this place. And now, the silence finally has an answer. Behind her, a drone rose into the twilight sky, recording the vigil for the memorial archive. The same kind of drone that had found her, now floating quietly above, capturing what it had once uncovered. From above, the scene looked peaceful, the winding river reflecting the candlelight, the crowd standing still, the clearing glowing faintly in the dark. For the first time in years, the area no longer felt haunted. It felt human again. As the last candle flickered out, Lisa walked to the edge of the clearing where the trees met the water. She crouched down, touching the soil that had once hidden her daughter. Mark joined her, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. The silence between them wasn't the kind that hurt anymore, it was the kind that holds what words can't carry. After a moment, Lisa whispered something, her voice barely audible. Those standing closest said she was talking to Emily, though no one could quite hear what she said until later, when a reporter asked. Lisa told them it was simple. We always knew she was close. The following weeks passed quietly. The media left, the town returned to its rhythms, and the river kept flowing. The sheriff's department archived the case file with a single note added to the final page. Remains located. Case closed. Accidental death. But for Detective Klein, closure never felt that clean. She still returned to the clearing sometimes, walking the same trail, with the sound of crunching leaves underfoot. She'd pause by the marker, watching how the light hit the spot differently each season. To her, it was more than a case solved, it was a reminder that sometimes the truth hides in places too ordinary to suspect. The footage from that final drone flight was released as part of the official case documentation. It showed the clearing at dusk, sunlight breaking through the canopy, glinting off the river. In one frame, the light strikes the water just right, scattering reflections that almost resemble movement, fleeting, soft, gone in a moment. Some who saw it said it felt like Emily was there, just beyond the frame. Others said it was just the wind. But everyone agreed that the forest looked different that day, lighter somehow. For the Harpers, life didn't return to normal because it couldn't. What they had instead was something quieter. Acceptance. The kind that doesn't erase the pain but folds it into memory until it becomes part of who you are. They still visited the river from time to time. Sometimes they brought flowers, sometimes they didn't. They didn't have to. The clearing had become a living memorial, its trees still growing, its silence no longer unbearable. In the end, there were no villains, no courtroom scenes, no dramatic revelations, just the truth, buried and found. A little girl lost in the woods, and a family that never stopped listening for her. And as the final image from that drone feed fades, the same lens that revealed the secret, now watching sunlight spill across the trees, the story ends not in tragedy, but in understanding. That sometimes the most painful mysteries aren't about what someone did, but about what time, nature, and silence can hide. And that love, even in its quietest form, never truly leaves the place where it began.